June 24th, 1944, the Philippine Sea. The morning sun burned through a haze of cordite and salt as hundreds of American fighters roared off carrier decks. Below them, the blue Pacific shimmered, calm, deceptive, while high above, Japan's last hope of air superiority waited in formation. Inside one F4U Corsair, Marine Captain Kenneth Walsh steadied his breathing. His aircraft vibrated with restrained fury, the wings trembling with energy. For months, American pilots had battled not just the enemy, but mathematics. Deflection shooting, the art of firing ahead of a moving target, demanded split-second judgment and superhuman precision. Too early, and your rounds vanished into empty sky. Too late, and death came first. But today, something new sat atop Walsh's instrument panel, a secret mechanical eye that could see into the future. As he rolled the Corsair into a climbing turn, the glowing pipper of the Mark 18 gyroscopic gunsight danced across his canopy glass, and then locked perfectly over the silver streak of a Japanese Zero. Walsh squeezed the trigger. In less than 2 seconds, the sky lit up, and the Zero dissolved into a trail of flame. If you think dogfighting was all instinct and guts, think again. Because in 1944, a spinning gyroscope would turn ordinary pilots into airborne snipers and make Japan's aces realize the sky no longer belonged to them. Spring 1943. The Pacific skies burned with the fury of desperate nations. From the Solomon Islands to the Marianas, American pilots fought an air war against an enemy whose mastery of maneuver seemed almost supernatural. The Japanese Zero, light, agile, and merciless, still ruled the turning fight. And for U.S. Navy and Marine aviators flying the rugged F4U Corsair, every duel was a deadly gamble of skill, instinct, and luck. The Corsair itself was a monster of metal and power, a 2,000 horsepower beast that could climb like a rocket and dive like a stone. But raw power wasn't enough when your enemy could twist, roll, and disappear in seconds. Most battles came down to a single burst, 1 second of gunfire that decided everything. The challenge? Hitting a target moving at 400 miles per hour, while both aircraft twisted violently through 3 dimensions. Deflection shooting, the art of firing ahead of your target to let the bullets and plane meet in midair, was one of the most difficult skills in aviation. Every pilot had to become a human computer, calculating angles, speeds, and lead times in an instant. The difference between victory and death often came down to a few degrees of aim. Lieutenant Robert Hansen of the F-17 Jolly Rogers described it simply. You didn't shoot at the Zero, you shot where it was going to be. The trick was knowing where that was before you ran out of luck. In those days, knowing meant guessing. Gunsights were little more than glass circles etched with simple markings. The pilot had to estimate how much to lead, 50 feet, maybe 100, all while pulling G-forces that blurred his vision and strained his neck. Every second, the enemy's angle changed. Every mistake meant wasted rounds or a missed opportunity. The Corsair carried 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, each spitting 800 rounds per minute. A short burst consumed precious ammunition in an instant. Many pilots returned to their carriers with empty belts, and not a single confirmed kill. Even experienced aces struggled with accuracy. Official Navy training manuals reported that in 1943, the average hit percentage in air combat was under 5%. That meant for every 100 bullets fired, 95 vanished into open sky. And yet, somehow, some men made it work. Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington, commanding the famed Black Sheep Squadron, led his Corsairs like a wolf pack. His method was raw aggression and instinct, diving from altitude, firing at point-blank range, and trusting his gut. But even Boyington admitted that half of his victories came from getting close enough that you couldn't miss. For the rest, the learning curve was brutal. Young pilots fresh from training schools faced Japanese aces who'd been flying combat missions since China in the 1930s. Those veterans didn't need better gun sights. They had experience. American engineers, however, had something else: innovation. At Wright Field in Ohio, A small group of scientists and engineers have been working on a secret project since 1941. Their goal? To solve the problem that killed more pilots than enemy bullets: inaccuracy. The concept was revolutionary, a gun sight that could think, one that didn't just show where the enemy was, but where he would be. It used a gyroscope, the same principle that kept aircraft instruments stable, to measure turn rate, acceleration, and target motion. The system would automatically project a glowing pipper onto the glass reflector, adjusting its position as the pilot or target maneuvered. In theory, all a pilot had to do was keep that pipper on the target and fire. No math, no guessing, just precision. But in 1943, that was theory, and many combat veterans laughed at it. Early test models were bulky, unreliable, and difficult to maintain on carrier decks. Pilots called them gadget sights and preferred the old reflector gun sights they trained with. Even so, a few engineers and test pilots believed this device could change the entire air war. Among them was Commander Bruce Griffin, a former fleet aviator now assigned to Naval Air Station Patuxent River. Griffin had seen too many good men die because their bullets went wide by inches. If we could give them a sight that removed guesswork, Griffin wrote in his log, we'd turn every good pilot into a great one. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the air battles only grew bloodier. The Corsair squadrons faced Zeros, Tonys, and Oscars across vast skies. Dogfights often ended before they truly began. Japanese pilots, experts in energy management and turn fighting, could outmaneuver even the fastest American aircraft. U.S. pilots had learned to adapt, using boom and zoom tactics, diving attacks, and teamwork to survive. But even in the best conditions, hitting a twisting Zero was like trying to thread a needle from a moving car. By mid-1943, Navy commanders were desperate for anything that could give their pilots a measurable edge. Training improvements helped. So did radar intercepts and formation tactics. But what they needed was accuracy, something that could make every bullet count. That's when the British sent over an intriguing report from their Royal Aircraft Establishment. The Royal Air Force had begun testing their own version of a gyroscopic sight, the Mark II Gyro-Gunsight, in Spitfires over Europe. Combat trials showed astonishing results. Average hit probability more than doubled. Some Spitfire squadrons reported accuracy rates 4 times higher than with traditional sights. When American observers saw the data, the decision was immediate. The U.S. would develop its own version for the Pacific War. The Mark 18 gyroscopic gun sight was born, compact, robust, and designed to fit inside the cramped cockpit of the Corsair, Hellcat, and Mustang. But in 1943, only a handful of prototypes existed. The war in the Pacific would not wait. So Corsair pilots continued to fight the hard way. Dogfights still relied on instinct and reflex. Veterans trained rookies with grim humor. Fire when he fills the ring, and pray you guessed right. It was a brutal kind of apprenticeship, one written in fire and steel. And yet, beneath the chaos, something was changing. By the end of 1943, the first shipments of the new gyroscopic sights arrived in testing units. At Patuxent River, the Navy's Flight Test Center, engineers bolted the strange new devices into F-6F Hellcats and F4U Corsairs. Pilots returning from test flights could hardly believe their eyes. It was like magic, one recalled. You turned, he turned, and the sight followed him. You didn't have to think. You just flew, kept the pipper on target, and fired. For the first time, the future of air combat was visible through a tiny circle of glowing light. But before it could reach the fleet, the system had to survive the harshest test of all, the Pacific War itself. Because for every advantage America gained, Japan adapted just as fiercely. And when the first Euro-equipped Corsairs finally arrived over the islands of the Marianas in 1944, the Japanese Zero pilots were about to discover that the rules of air combat had changed forever. Spring 1944. The U.S. Navy's Pacific Campaign had become a relentless push westward. From the Marshall Islands to the Marianas, carriers prowled the ocean like floating fortresses, and above them, the skies swarmed with F-6F Hellcats and F4U Corsairs. But despite overwhelming numbers, American pilots still faced a deadly truth. Even the best aircraft couldn't win a dogfight if the bullets didn't hit. At forward airfields on Espiritu Santo and Guadalcanal, mechanics worked under makeshift tents, bolting a strange new device into the cockpits of Corsairs arriving from the States. The pilots gathered around, curious. The gun sight looked alien, a small black box with gyroscopes spinning inside, a glowing dot projected on a pane of glass. When the pilot turned the control ring on his throttle, the dot danced across the reflector in perfect sync with the aircraft's motion. It seemed alive. The Mark 18 Gyro-Gunsight had arrived. It was the American adaptation of the British innovation that had already stunned Luftwaffe pilots over Europe. But this version had been hardened for carrier use, built to survive salt air, rough deck landings, and violent G-forces. Inside, miniature gyroscopes measured the Corsair's roll and pitch, predicting where enemy aircraft would be moments later. To use it, the pilot simply dialed in the enemy's wingspan on a small knob, then kept the glowing pipper over the target. The gun sight did the rest, automatically adjusting for deflection, speed, and turn radius. To veteran pilots who'd spent years relying on gut instinct, it was witchcraft. Lieutenant WWII Faitner of VF-10 remembered his first test flight vividly. The first time I squeezed the trigger, I saw tracers walk straight into the target. I didn't think, I just held the dot on him and fired. It was like the airplane could read my mind. But acceptance didn't come easily. Many combat-hardened pilots distrusted new gadgets. They'd survived on instinct, and anything that interfered with that felt dangerous. Some even removed the Gyro-sight entirely, reinstalling their old reflectors. Yet as the first combat reports came in, skepticism began to fade. In April 1944, Corsair squadrons of Marine Air Group 31 began operational trials over the Marshall Islands. Their mission: intercept Japanese raiders attacking supply convoys. The results stunned everyone. Within 2 weeks, kill ratios tripled. Pilots who had never scored a single aerial victory were suddenly knocking zeros out of the sky with single bursts. Debriefings revealed the same story again and again. He turned, I kept the dot on him, one squeeze, and he blew up. Data analysis from these missions showed average hit accuracy rising from 6% to 22%, an astronomical improvement by wartime standards. For Japanese aviators, the effect was immediate and terrifying. In the early days of the war, they had enjoyed the luxury of being untouchable in tight dogfights. Their zeros turn rate and agility made them nearly impossible targets in close engagements. But now, even evasive maneuvers weren't saving them. Corsair pilots were no longer guessing. They were calculating automatically, invisibly, through a gyroscope spinning behind a thin glass pane. By May 1944, the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics issued a directive: all new production Corsairs and Hellcats to be fitted with Mark 18 or equivalent gyroscopic gunsights effective immediately. The Pacific Fleet was transforming from a force of instinctive flyers into one of mechanical sharpshooters. At the same time, a tactical revolution unfolded in training. At Naval Air Station Kaneohe Bay in Hawaii, returning aces were now tasked with teaching gunnery using the new technology. Pilots flew mock dogfights against target drones, learning how to trust the pipper. It wasn't easy. Some overshot. Others didn't believe the sight could keep up in steep dives. But gradually, the muscle memory changed. Captain Richard Harmer of VF-17 recalled, once you stopped fighting it, the Gyro-sight became part of you. You didn't lead the target anymore. You followed the dot. It was like flying with a ghost that could see a half-second into the future. By June, the Corsairs of VMF-113 received their first full complement of Gyro-equipped fighters. The timing couldn't have been more critical. The Mariana Islands campaign was about to begin, a massive operation that would pit hundreds of American carrier fighters against Japan's best remaining pilots. The stage was set for the technology's baptism by fire. June 19, 1944. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. Dawn broke over the carrier task force like molten gold on the horizon. American radar screens lit up with hundreds of blips, the first wave of Japanese strike aircraft inbound from the north. Corsair and Hellcat squadrons scrambled, engines roaring, wings unfolding like metallic eagles. In the sky above, the new gunsights came alive. As the first Japanese dive bombers appeared, Corsair pilots locked onto their targets. The gyros hummed, the pippers danced, and tracers lanced through the sky like laser beams. The kill rate was devastating. Marine Captain Archie Donahue later reported, "We'd roll in behind a zero, line up the pipper, and that was it. One burst, and they came apart. You could see the confidence drain out of them." What followed became known in history as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In a single day, over 350 Japanese aircraft were destroyed, most by fighters. American pilots credited their success not only to training and teamwork, but to something new: precision. Flight records from Corsair-equipped squadrons showed that 40% of all kills were achieved using less than a 2-second burst, a rate unheard of before the Gyro-sight. For the first time in the Pacific War, technology had turned American pilots into true marksmen, not just survivors, but snipers of the sky. After the battle, the reports poured in. Pilots who'd once struggled to hit anything beyond 200 yards were now scoring confirmed kills at 600 to 800 yards. Engineers back at Wright Field studied combat film and data reels, refining the system even further. A new model, the Mark 23, was proposed for even greater stability at high G loads. But the Mark 18 was already rewriting the rules of air combat, and word of its performance spread fast. By late 1944, the Japanese Naval General Staff had begun intercepting intelligence about a new American auto-aiming gun sight. Some dismissed it as propaganda. Others feared it was true. A report recovered after the war from the Imperial Japanese Navy's 343rd Air Group training records read, "Enemy aircraft now display extraordinary accuracy in deflection fire. New device suspected that predicts target movement. Avoid turning engagements." It was too late. The Corsair, once considered too unstable for carrier use, had become the most feared fighter in the Pacific. And the technology inside its cockpit was making sure that when American pilots fired, they didn't miss. By the end of 1944, the Gyro-sight had transformed air combat into something entirely new, a blend of human instinct and mechanical precision. But its greatest test was still to come. In the final year of the Pacific War, as Japan threw its last and most desperate fighters into the skies, the Corsair's Gyro-Gunsight would prove itself not just as a tool of technology, but as the deciding edge in the deadliest air duels of the war. January 1945. The Pacific was burning. From the Philippines to the shores of Okinawa, the U.S. Navy's fast carrier groups ruled the seas, and above them, the sky belonged to the F4U Corsair. Its inverted gull wings, its monstrous 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine, and its distinctive whine as it tore through the clouds made it both beautiful and terrifying. But now, with the Mark 18 Gyro-Gunsight bolted into its cockpit, it had become something else entirely, a surgical weapon of war. On carrier decks like the USS Bunker Hill, pilots strapped into their aircraft as mechanics gave final checks to the spinning gyros inside their sights. Each one hummed faintly, a sound that to the pilots had become the whisper of death for the enemy. At dawn, Lieutenant Dean S. Laird, one of the Navy's most skilled aviators, taxied to the launch position. He'd already shot down German and Japanese planes, one of the few aces to do so. But even he couldn't believe what the new gunsight could do. When he tested it in combat over Luzon, he reported, "Before, we used to fire and hope. Now you fire and know." In the skies over the Philippines, dogfights erupted as Japanese Ki-43 Oscars and A-6 M0s tried to defend convoys evacuating from Manila. But the battles had changed. The Americans were hitting with uncanny precision. Corsairs rolled in from altitude, locking onto targets with the pipper glowing steady on the windscreen. When they squeezed the trigger, their 6 Browning .50 caliber guns spat fire, and Japanese aircraft that once could outmaneuver them now burst into flames in seconds. The Marines of VMF 124 radioed back after their first combat sorties using the Gyro-sight. It's like shooting fish in a barrel. We don't miss anymore. The secret wasn't just the gunsight's gyroscope. It was the combination of machine and man. The Corsair's raw speed and climb rate made it deadly in the vertical plane, and the Gyro-sight allowed pilots to exploit that perfectly. Before, when a Japanese pilot broke left or dove away, the American would lose his deflection angle, firing blind. But now, the sight predicted where the target would be, allowing perfect lead fire even in high G turns. By early 1945, air-kill ratios were staggering. Combat data from the 5th Fleet recorded a 19-to-1 kill ratio in favor of Corsairs, numbers once thought impossible. In one engagement off Formosa, 24 Corsairs tangled with over 70 enemy aircraft. Only 2 American fighters were damaged. 27 Japanese planes went down in less than 10 minutes. Naval intelligence officers analyzing gun camera footage noted the same eerie pattern. Almost every burst was perfectly centered on the target. No spray, no guasti da munition, just a flash, and then debris spiraling into the sea. As the war dragged into its final months, Japan's air defenses grew more desperate. Veteran pilots were nearly gone, replaced by barely trained recruits sent up in outdated Zeros and Ki 84 Franks with little fuel and less experience. Against them were American aviators armed with a weapon that removed all guesswork. When Major Gregory "Pappy" Boynton's famed Black Sheep squadron re-entered combat, many of his men flew upgraded Corsairs equipped with Gyro-sights. In his memoir, Boynton wrote, "The enemy's mistake was thinking bravery could overcome physics. But this little glass circle, it turned our pilots into ghosts. You couldn't escape it." By February 1945, Japanese officers began reporting what they called invisible accuracy, Corsairs firing from impossible angles, killing instantly even in tight turns. A Japanese survivor of the 343rd Kokutai, the elite air defense unit based in Japan itself, recalled after the war, "They didn't miss. We could see their guns flash, and then there was fire. We didn't understand why. We thought maybe their bullets were guided. They weren't, but the Gyro-sight was doing the guiding." Behind the front lines, the Navy's gunnery schools were transforming. At NAS Miami and NAS Patuxent River, new pilots were no longer taught to eyeball lead angles. They were taught to trust the pipper. Instructors built simulator rigs using old Corsair cockpits and rotating target models, allowing students to feel how the pipper moved as they banked. Within weeks, accuracy scores doubled. By March 1945, every new Corsair rolling off the Vought assembly line carried a factory-installed Mark 18 or the improved Mark 23 Gyro-Gunsight. Engineers at the Naval Research Laboratory refined the optics further, adding anti-glare coatings and automatic brightness adjustment for carrier night landings. To the men who flew with it, it wasn't just technology, it was insurance. Lieutenant Harold Glasser of VMF 222 said in an interview after the war, "When you're chasing a Zero at 300 knots, you don't think. You just keep that red dot steady. And when it's steady, that's the end of him." As the Americans advanced toward Okinawa, Japanese command pulled their remaining air units back to defend the home islands. The Imperial General Staff believed terrain and proximity would favor their side. They were wrong again. In April 1945, Corsair squadron from carriers like the USS Bunker Hill, USS Essex, and USS Hancock began the Tokyo strikes. Massive bombing raids and fighter sweeps over Honshu. The first wave met fierce resistance from the 343rd Air Group, led by the legendary ace Minoru Jinda, flying the last of Japan's capable fighters, the N1K-2J Shidenkai, or George. For the first few minutes, the dogfights were intense, swirling high above the coastline. But soon, the Gyro-Gunsight showed its dominance. Corsairs didn't waste ammunition. They fired in short, devastating bursts. Film footage later recovered showed multiple Japanese aircraft destroyed in under 2 seconds of firing. Marine ace Bob Brunson described it bluntly. We weren't better shots, the gun sight was. You'd pull lead, keep the dot steady, and the sight did the math faster than your brain. By the end of the day, 343rd Kokutai lost over 40 aircraft. The Americans lost none. After these engagements, even skeptical pilots became believers. Reports flooded command channels praising the Gyro-Sight's performance. At Wright Field, engineers analyzed every second of combat footage to refine future weapons. They realized that the principle, predicting target movement through gyroscopic calculation, could be applied beyond fighters. Within months, the same technology inspired systems for early radar-guided bombs and the first lead computing gun sights for naval AA guns. In just 1 year, the Gyro-Sight had transformed the U.S. Navy's air arm from instinctive fighters into mathematically precise hunters. And the Japanese, who once dominated dogfighting through agility, could no longer outfly the future. By the spring of 1945, the Corsair had earned its final reputation. The most lethal piston fighter ever built. And behind that legacy was not just power or speed, but a tiny spinning gyroscope that made its pilots almost supernatural in battle. The Gyro-Gunsight had done more than make Corsair pilot snipers. It had rewritten the very physics of aerial warfare. April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday. Dawn rose blood-red over the WWII Islands. Below, the dark waves of the Pacific were filled with the largest invasion fleet in human history. More than 1,500 ships, carrying the combined might of the U.S. Army, Navy, and Marine Corps. The operation was code-named Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa, and it would become the final and deadliest battle of the Pacific War. Above that armada, the sky thundered with the engines of F4U Corsairs, F6F Hellcats, and SB-2C Helldivers, weaving protective patterns over the fleet. But this time, every Corsair carried a secret advantage. Bolted to each cockpit was the Mark 18 Gyro-Gunsight, now fully integrated into pilot training and doctrine. The Navy's flyers had become something new, not just dogfighters but aerial snipers. At 0830 hours, radar aboard the USS West Virginia picked up the first wave. Over 100 Japanese aircraft, Zeros, Oscars, and Ki, 84 Franks, were inbound from Kyushu. But these weren't traditional fighters. They were kamikazes, loaded with 250-kilogram bombs and barely enough fuel for a one-way trip. These pilots intended to die. Their mission: crash into American ships and drag them to the bottom of the sea. For the Americans, it was psychological warfare, facing an enemy who refused to live. But the Corsair pilots had no time for hesitation. From the decks of carriers like USS Bunker Hill, USS Essex, and USS Intrepid, the Marine Air Groups, VMF 123, 224, and 312, roared into the air. At 12,000 feet, Lieutenant Harry Ferrier and his wingmen spotted the first formation, a swarm of Zeros diving from the east. Ferrier called it in. "This is Blue 4. I've got bogeys, Angels 1-2, closing fast." The Japanese formation broke apart, diving straight toward the fleet. But as they came within range, the Corsairs pounced. Ferrier rolled inverted, dove, and pulled the glowing Pipper onto the lead kamikaze's wingtip. The Gyro-Gunsights, gyros, spun, calculating angles as the target screamed past 400 knots. He squeezed the trigger once, a 2-second burst. The tracers curved perfectly ahead of the Zero, connecting in midair. The aircraft exploded into a ball of flame. "The sight did all the work," Ferrier recalled later. "I didn't have time to think. I just trusted the duck." As the day wore on, more waves came. Kamikazes attacked in packs of 20, then 30. They came from the clouds, from the sea, from the glare of the sun. But the Corsairs met them every time. The Gyro-Gunsight turned chaos into calm precision. Where older pilots once panicked and fired wildly, now they waited. They watched the Pipper settle, fired one controlled burst, and down went another attacker. By mid-afternoon, over 185 enemy aircraft had been shot down, most by Corsairs. U.S. losses, less than a dozen. The kill ratio was obscene. Japanese observers on Kyushu, watching the dogfights through field scopes, couldn't believe it. Their post-battle reports described the Americans as having unearthly accuracy. One intelligence officer wrote, "Their shooting is too perfect. They fire once, and the target vanishes. We cannot understand it." They didn't know that the secret lay inside a box no bigger than a lunch tin, a gyroscope spinning faster than the human eye could perceive. During the Okinawa campaign, VMF 323, the Death Rattlers, became legendary. Operating from USS Bunker Hill, their Corsairs tore through kamikaze formations daily, using the new Gyro-sight to deadly effect. Captain Harold L. Spears scored 5 kills in just 4 sorties, a feat that once required weeks of combat. His gun camera footage, studied later by engineers, showed something incredible. Each enemy destroyed within 1.5 seconds of firing. It wasn't luck. It was math. The Mark 18 had transformed a gunfight into an equation, and for the Corsair pilots, the answer was always the same. The target died. That morning, the carrier USS Bunker Hill was preparing to launch another strike. The deck was packed with fully armed Corsairs, engines idling. Out of the morning haze, 2 Japanese Zeros broke through. They came in fast, too fast for the gunners to react. The first slammed into the flight deck, exploding in a fireball. The second crashed into the ship's island structure. The explosions tore through the carrier. Over 390 sailors and airmen were killed. But from the surviving escort carriers, the response was immediate. A swarm of Gyro-equipped Corsairs took off in pursuit of the remaining kamikazes. In the following hour, they destroyed 48 enemy aircraft without a single American loss. For the pilots who survived Bunker Hill, it was vengeance guided by technology. By June, the skies over Okinawa belonged entirely to the Americans. But for the pilots, the cost was visible every day. Burning ships, oil on the water, and the knowledge that the war was nearing its brutal end. Still they flew. Still they fought. One pilot, Lieutenant Robert Hawk Hansen, became a symbol of the new age of aerial warfare. Using his Gyro-sight, he scored 25 victories before being killed during a strafing run near Rabaul. His gunnery films were studied for years afterward, a perfect demonstration of technology and instinct merged into one. Hansen's combat footage became required viewing at post-war training schools. Every kill was clean, a single burst never wasted. He was the perfect blend of pilot and machine, one instructor said. He didn't outfly them, he outcalculated them. That's how many Corsair pilots described Okinawa. With the Gyro-Gunsight, aerial combat no longer felt like gambling on reflexes. It felt clinical, mechanical, inevitable. A Japanese ace named Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of the few survivors from the early war years, watched his comrades fall from the skies and realized what had changed. The Americans had machines that could think faster than we could, he said years later. Our courage was useless. The Corsairs dominated every engagement. They shredded kamikaze formations, strafed enemy airfields, and escorted bombers over Kyushu with surgical precision. By the time the Battle for Okinawa ended in June 1945, the Navy recorded over 7,800 Japanese aircraft destroyed, more than half by fighters using Gyro-Gunsights. Back in the U.S., engineers and strategists studied every piece of combat data. They realized what the Mark 18 had achieved. It had erased the gap between human reaction and machine calculation. What began as a small device in a Corsair cockpit would now inspire the next generation of targeting systems, the computing gunsights of the jet age. As peace neared, one Navy test pilot summarized it best during a post-war debrief. The Corsair with a Gyro-sight wasn't just a fighter plane. It was the first thinking weapon. The Battle for Okinawa proved that courage wins wars, but technology decides how long they last. And when the smoke cleared, the Americans had something no other nation did. Pilots who could shoot as if they already knew the outcome. Because in their cockpits, spinning silently, was the future. July 1945. The Pacific War was gasping in its final months. Tokyo was rubble. Nagoya was ash. Japan's airfields, once crowded with proud Zero squadrons, now lay silent, their hangars gutted, their runways scarred by bombs. But deep inside the remaining bases on Kyushu, a handful of air units still trained, desperate, young, and hopelessly outmatched. These were the remnants of the 343rd Kokutai, led by the brilliant but doomed Captain Minoru Genda, the same man who had once helped plan Pearl Harbor. Now, his mission was to defend the homeland. And against him were the F4U Corsairs of the U.S. Navy, hunters armed with a technology Japan didn't even know existed, the Mark 18 Gyro-Gunsight. From carriers anchored off Okinawa, the Americans launched wave after wave of fighter sweeps into Japanese airspace. The Corsairs flew low over misty coastlines, their black and blue silhouettes flickering in the morning haze. Each pilot sat behind a glowing pipper, a tiny red that hummed with deadly precision. As they closed in on Kyushu's air bases, Kanoya, Kagoshima, and Oita, the first interceptors rose to meet them. N1K2J Shidenkai George fighters, some of the finest piston-engine aircraft Japan ever built. They were fast, heavily armed, and flown by the last of Japan's surviving aces. But when they met the Corsairs, they died. In the first major engagement near Kagoshima Bay, 20 Shuriken scrambled to intercept an American strike group. Within 6 minutes, 14 were destroyed. None of the Americans were hit. Gun camera footage recovered later showed the truth. The Corsairs never missed. The Gyro-sight led their fire perfectly through the Shiden's desperate turns. Even the evasive barrel rolls, once the Zero's signature escape, were useless. It was like they knew where we would be, one Japanese pilot later said. They fired once, and it was already over. For decades, air combat had been an art of intuition. Pilots relied on reflexes, anticipation, and sheer nerve. But in these final months, that art was dying. Now it was science. Each Corsair's Mark 18 was constantly spinning, a gyroscope calculating angular velocity and predicting lead angles with mathematical precision. The pilot didn't have to feel the shot anymore. He just had to trust the machine. Lieutenant Dean S. Laird, now an ace, described it in his combat log from July 16th. They came head-on. I broke high and rolled over. Pipper on target, one burst. Both engines flamed. It felt less like fighting and more like ending a calculation. The Corsair pilots no longer wasted ammunition or time. Their kill rates skyrocketed. For the Japanese, it was like fighting ghosts. The Americans no longer seemed human. And morale crumbled. Japanese ground controllers at Kanoya reported that new pilots often froze mid-fight, unable to comprehend how they were being hit before they even finished their maneuvers. Some believed the Americans had built a self-aiming gun. They were right, though they didn't understand how. By August 1945, the Imperial General Staff's reports painted a grim picture. Enemy fighters now possessed deflection, fire accuracy beyond human capability. Avoid engagement, retreat into clouds, or attack from behind. But even those tactics failed. The Corsair's Gyro-sight didn't need clear weather or perfect angles. It calculated faster than any man could think. Over Tokyo Bay, a squadron from VMF 312 engaged 9 enemy aircraft in what became one of the last true dogfights of the war. Captain James N. Cupp described it in his debrief. They came out of the haze in tight formation. We rolled, Dove, and I saw the first one cross my sights. The Pipper stayed steady, 2-second burst. Fireball. I shifted right, same thing. 3 kills in 1 pass. It was mechanical, clinical. The battle lasted less than 4 minutes. Every Japanese aircraft was destroyed. When the Corsairs returned to the carrier, their ammunition counts were nearly full. They had used less than 200 rounds each, an impossible statistic in earlier wars. The Japanese still fought with honor, courage, and sacrifice, but none of it mattered anymore. The Gyro-Gunsight had tipped the balance so completely that human courage alone could no longer change the outcome. A captured Japanese air officer, interrogated after the war, admitted, "We trained our men to see and react. The Americans trained their machines to predict." We could not win. It was the ultimate irony. The same nation that had stunned the world with technological surprise at Pearl Harbor now fell victim to an invention smaller than a coffee cup. On August 9th, 1945, 2 days after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, Corsairs from VMF 214, the famous Black Sheep Squadron, took off for what would unknowingly become one of their final combat missions of the war. Their target, a railway yard near Nagasaki. But as they approached the coast, radar picked up a handful of Japanese interceptors, perhaps the last operational flight of the once mighty Imperial Navy Air Service. The Corsairs broke formation. The lead pilot, Major Robert Brunson, locked onto the nearest target. His gyro-sight tracked perfectly through the Shiden's desperate barrel roll. The Pipper didn't care, he said later. No matter what he did, it stayed on him. He fired once. The enemy exploded in midair. Moments later, a second aircraft was hit by his wingman. One short burst, perfectly led. That was it. The last air battle over Japan ended in less than 2 minutes. When Japan finally surrendered on August 15th, 1945, the Corsairs sat quiet on carrier decks, their guns still loaded, their gyros still humming softly in the heat. The war that had begun with Zeros dominating Pearl Harbor had ended with Zeros being vaporized by Corsairs guided by invisible technology. The Mark 18 Gyro-Gunsight had done what no single weapon could. It made the human equation obsolete. After the war, American engineers studied thousands of gun camera films. The accuracy stunned even them. Some Corsair squadrons achieved kill ratios exceeding 22-1 in the final 6 months, the highest ever recorded in piston engine combat. But for the pilots, the feeling was bittersweet. Lieutenant Harold Glasser said it best during an interview in 1946. The sight made killing easy. Too easy. You stopped thinking about the man in the cockpit. You just saw the dot, fired, and it was done. The Gyro-Gunsight had turned warriors into executioners, precise, detached, efficient. It ended the war faster, but also changed what it meant to fight. The lessons learned from the Corsair's Gyro-sight shaped the next generation of warfare. Engineers at Wright Field and the Naval Research Lab adapted its principles for jet fighters. The A-1 Skyraider, the F-86 Sabre, and eventually radar-assisted fire control systems in Cold War jets. Every guided missile, every lead computing radar, every modern fighter's heads-up display, all trace their lineage back to that spinning gyroscope in a Corsair cockpit. By the time peace came, Japan's skies were silent. And in that silence lay the story of how technology had finally overtaken courage. The Corsair had not just dominated the Pacific. It had redefined what it meant to aim. August 1945. The Pacific sky, once thick with smoke, tracer fire, and the cries of desperate pilots, was now eerily quiet. The Corsairs that had once roared over the empire of Japan now sat still on carrier decks, their blue paint sun-faded, their engines cooling for the last time. The war was over, but the weapon that helped end it, a small spinning gyroscope inside a gun sight, had changed warfare forever. In the post-war months, Allied engineers pored over combat reports, gun camera reels, and performance statistics. They realized something staggering. Corsair pilots equipped with Mark 18 Gyro-Gunsights were hitting their targets with an accuracy rate 3 times higher than those without it. The mechanical brain inside the sight, no bigger than a teacup, had done the unthinkable. It had replaced human instinct with cold, mathematical precision. In the hands of a skilled pilot, it was unstoppable. But in truth, it made any pilot deadly. That terrified strategists almost as much as it impressed them. Before the Gyro-sight, aerial combat was an art form, a deadly dance of instincts and nerves. Dogfights were personal. You saw the whites of the enemy's eyes before you fired. But in 1945, something fundamental changed. The Corsair pilots no longer relied on feeling the shot. They trusted the glowing Pipper, that small red that moved with ghost-like precision, predicting where the enemy would be before he even got there. And when the Pipper touched the target, they squeezed the trigger. That was it. The duel was over. No guessing, no hesitation, no second chances. The human element was gone. After Japan's surrender, American intelligence officers interviewed surviving airmen from the 343rd Kokutai, Japan's last elite fighter unit. They were asked what had broken their resistance in those final months. One pilot, a veteran of over 50 dogfights, gave a haunting reply. "We stopped believing in our hands. The Americans didn't fight us, their machines did." He wasn't wrong. The Japanese had built aircraft with unmatched agility and trained pilots to fight with instinct and honor. But by 1945, the fight was no longer fair. The Corsair pilots weren't guessing. They were calculating. Every maneuver, every turn, every burst of fire was predicted by the gyroscope spinning silently beneath their gun sight. It was as if the Americans could see into the future. After the war, a psychological study by the U.S. Navy analyzed how the Gyro-sight changed the mindset of its pilots. The conclusion was chilling. Mechanical accuracy reduces emotional hesitation. The act of killing becomes procedural. In 1946, during a public demonstration at NAS Patuxent River, test pilot Lieutenant Commander James "Jim" Verdin flew an F4U Corsair fitted with the same Mark 18 sight that had dominated the Pacific. Before a crowd of veterans, engineers, and reporters, Verdin executed a mock dogfight against a drone target, a small, unmanned aircraft painted red. He circled once, locked on, and fired a single short burst. The drone exploded instantly. The crowd erupted in applause, but the old Corsair aces watching didn't cheer. They understood what they were seeing. The era of man-versus-man combat was gone. From now on, machines would do the thinking, and soon the fighting. When the last Corsairs were retired from active service in the 1950s, their Mark 18s were dismantled and replaced with radar systems. But a few of those original gun sights survive today, sitting quietly in museums, their gyros still capable of spinning if you power them up. Each one is a relic of a moment in history, the exact point when human instinct met machine logic, and the world of war changed forever. The Japanese never expected it. No one did. A few ounces of spinning metal had redefined air combat and ended an empire's dream of dominance. The story of the Corsair's Gyro-sight isn't just about machines or victories. It's about how technology quietly reshapes humanity. In the skies over Japan, courage and brilliance collided with cold precision. And in that clash, one truth emerged. Progress always wins, but it never comes free. So the next time you see a jet streak across the sky or watch a missile find its mark with perfect accuracy, remember where it began. It started with a single red pipper glowing in a Corsair cockpit, and a generation of pilots who learned that in war, the most dangerous weapon is the one that thinks for you.